I'm Rachel Sarah Kennedy, Head of Global Partnerships at UKRI, and I'm the moderator of the full scientific session, The Future of Cities, Green Buildings and Sustainable Infrastructure. Thank you very much for joining us and for your interest in this session. This presentation is one of 3 pre-recorded videos focusing on a speaker's material before all panelists will come together in February for a live discussion. In this video, Jaideep Gupte, a fellow of the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex, and also a UKRI challenge leader for the Cities and Sustainable Infrastructure portfolio of the Global Challenges Research Fund, will present to us. In this presentation, he'll be discussing the sustainability of cities in the Global South, focusing on their development, digital accessibility, and social inclusivity. Following Jaideep's presentation, Marc-Olivier Coppens, the director of the EPSRC Frontier Engineering Centre for Nature-Inspired Engineering and the professor of chemical engineering at University College London, will join to discuss the material. So without further ado, if I can hand over to you, Jaideep, for you to start your presentation.
I'm Jaideep Gupte. I'm a fellow at the Institute of Development Studies in the UK, and I lead the Cities and Sustainable Infrastructure portfolio for the Global Challenges Research Fund. I'd like to talk to you about cities and sustainable infrastructure in low and middle income countries. And I think this is a really significant and important moment to be having this conversation. And here's why. So in 2015, the world signed up to 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And this was countries coming together to form a global compact to create a future where no one was left behind. Now, these goals came with a deadline, and we're now in the final decade in which we need to achieve these goals. So what do ground realities in this final decade of action look like? More than half of humanity already lives in urban areas, and we're predicting that we will add about 2.5 billion more people to the world's urban population, current urban population of 4.2 billion by 2050. Now, the important bit is that virtually all of this urban growth will occur in Asia and in Africa. And just 3 countries, India, China, and Nigeria, will together account for nearly 30 to 35% of this urban growth. India is projected to add over 400 million, China will add over 250 million, and Nigeria will add nearly 200 million urban residents to their current population, and over half of these will live in small and medium-sized towns. So the really big challenge here is that 1 in 3 of those living in low and middle income countries do so in what are known as informal settlements, where they lack basic services, often living in very precarious conditions, and importantly, they lack the opportunities to shape the decisions about their environment. And indeed, looking forward, the infrastructural gap is immense. So 70% of the infrastructure we require, that is the pipes, the wires, the roads, the buildings, to accommodate the growing urban population simply has not been built as yet. And so the consequences of the decisions we've made so far has left us at an important juncture, right? So cities are generating 60% of global GDP. And yet, as I've described, the sort of mistakes that we make in brick and mortar and in failed urban planning have been hugely costly for those who have not been able to share in this prosperity. You know, another way to look at this is to recognize that cities today account for nearly 70% of the world's CO2 emissions. So we cannot continue in terms of business as usual. But then how do we do cities and infrastructure differently? Well, I'd like to offer 3 suggestions. The first is to localize materials and design. And to illustrate my point, I'd like to take you to Kibera, which is an informal settlement in the city of Nairobi in Kenya, in East Africa. Now, this settlement is just a few kilometers from downtown Nairobi, very built up area of Nairobi. And the settlement occupies around 2/3 the area of, say, Central Park in New York, but it is home to 350,000 residents. Beyond this density, Kibera is characterized by a lack of solid waste management, limited sanitation facilities, low income, high unemployment, land tenure continues to be quite precarious. And indeed, there's very little open space for children and for communities to gather in. Now, an interesting intervention to address these issues has been an area-based collaboration that was community-oriented, that is known as the Kibera Public Space Project. And this was a collaboration between the Konkui Design Initiative and the Riverside Usafi Group. Now, the key aspects that led to the success in this intervention, the first was around it having an area-based focus. Now, this really means taking a system-wide understanding of the cascading, interrelated vulnerabilities, risks, and needs that a community has. And so in this case, taking the whole settlement in view rather than a very site-specific or indeed a service-specific view. Placing community organization at the heart of building public infrastructure was also one of the keys to success. And indeed, in this example, required setting up a community organization before any architectural interventions could take place, so that the discussion, the dialogue, the conversation with the community could feed into the design and implementation phase. The use of local materials was also a key to success, and indeed not simply because of the environmental credentials or indeed the local appropriateness of these materials, but also to build a degree of ownership in the community. Indeed, this particular project was known as, locally affectionately known as, the bricks, referring to the soil stabilized bricks that were used in its construction. The second suggestion I'd like to make is to integrate renewable energies, photovoltaic technologies, with affordable city living. Now, affordable homes are in critical short supply. Indeed, this is a global crisis, but we must also maintain a razor-sharp focus on the billions of urban dwellers who do not have access to hygiene and hand washing facilities, urban dwellers who don't have access to safe sanitation facilities. This is indeed extremely important in moments of pandemic as we find ourselves in currently. And so while affordability of homes is an important and a key issue for cities, homes need also to be adequate in the ways they provide basic services to meet our needs and further human well-being, but they also need to be sustainably built. Now, take the example of India, where indeed the housing shortage is worsening. We predict that India will need to build a city the size of Chicago every year to meet this need. An interesting collaboration trying to address this is one led by the University of Swansea called Sunrise, that's seeking to address energy poverty through the development of next-gen solar technologies by bringing together really leading cutting-edge research across the UK and India, but putting it into contact with local community needs. Now, this has meant translating research, for instance, from the UK context to the Indian one. So reformulating ideas around heating homes to what they might require in India, which is to cool homes. It has involved translating findings from rural settings to urban contexts. So moving in the Indian context, moving from bespoke, small scale construction, which is largely how housing construction is done in India, to more large-scale, scalable, prefabricated materials that can be integrated with photovoltaics. But importantly, this has also involved addressing local, gendered, design-based challenges to introducing new technologies. So working in dense urban environments where shade can be an issue, looking at gendered roles to understand how new technologies can be taken up inside the home and outside, but also looking at some of the design challenges and constraints that impact on people's behaviors and indeed their ability to take up new technologies. And the third suggestion and final suggestion I'd like to make is to involve citizens directly into the making of smart cities. Word of caution here, because the smart city as a concept has indeed taken a hold of our discourse over the past decade, and yet we find that the connected smart city is a reality only for some. Billions continue to not have access to affordable internet. And indeed, across low and middle income countries, women are less likely to own a smartphone or use mobile internet. And in the sorts of informal urban settlements I've been speaking of, this gender gap is exacerbated. And so to address these issues, we must aspire to a smartness that is somehow more democratic than it is technocratic. Now, it's becoming very clear that it will not be possible to deliver the 2030 agenda without cities that are sustainable and inclusive. The challenges are just too big. But if we are to take this position, the challenge is not simply technological, but also one of governance. And certainly in our work, we find that values and mission statements are actually appropriate starting points for cities and citizens groups, rather than an alternative viewpoint that might begin by looking at resource constraints that tends to be more technology focused rather than people centered. But at the moment, there's a problem in that nearly all of the evidence on how technologies and data should be governed is coming from the global north. So we're not learning nearly well enough from frugal innovation, from local solutions. And in terms of addressing the types of extreme inequalities and access to services in cities of the global south that I've been speaking of, we do need to pay particular attention to who are the least resourced, or who continue to be most marginalized, or indeed who are the most vulnerable, and expressly set out our technologies so that we're looking to involve them. And so how we make cities smart and inclusive, how we scale up small innovation, or indeed how we scale down and localize solutions really does depend, I suppose, at least in part, on how interdisciplinary and how equitable our research and policy partnerships are. Thank you.
Can I now invite Marc-Olivier to join the discussion?
Thank you. You posed a rhetoric question and then kind of you discussed it afterwards. How do we do cities and infrastructure? And I'd like to ask a bit more about this do. So, you know, when we think about the work we do at the Center for Nature-Inspired Engineering, we learn mechanistic fundamental lessons from nature to help innovate and design solutions, including the built environment. And cities and infrastructure, they're rarely fully designed, greenfield and grounds up. I mean, and also, of course, the informal settlements and the refugee camps are even an example of that. Now, like in nature, they might emerge and self-organize, grow organically, but of course also regulation and various control mechanisms play a role. And these tend to differ, often in nature and society, and so perhaps something could be learned from nature. And how would you contrast the different ways in which cities and infrastructure form? And do you think we could learn from natural ecosystems in assisting some of our current issues, including the social ones, and achieving different SDGs?
Well, that's a very, very big question, Marc-Olivier. And to me, cities, particularly cities of the global south, are not in tune with nature, at least to the extent that they could be. And to me, one of the most glaring examples of this is the materials that are used to build them. You know, most of these concrete monstrosities, when the ecological or environmental context would demand something very different, right? Concrete and wet, humid conditions, high amounts of rainfall just don't get along. We should be looking to build cities with materials that work better with nature. And I think that would be a great place to start. And on the positive note that I promised, you know, I take a lot from the visionary architect Rahul Malhotra's ideas, and I think they're important here. So he has been challenging us to think about impermanent cities and not leave a mark on nature. So he studied this phenomenon that is called the Kumbh Mela. Now, this is a festival in India that occurs on the banks of the river Ganga every 12 years. And close to 100 million people congregate for this festival. And there's this mega city that pops up, you know, with roads, with housing, with public facilities, even garbage collection networks, solid waste management. But just as quickly as this city pops up, it also is dismantled and it leaves no mark on the riverbanks, no permanent mark. And so there's real lessons about how we might seek to live with nature. They don't have to be so dramatic. But indeed, there are some really positive examples to learn from around the world.
That ties in very much with aspects of nature being also self-healing, with the fact that you have circular aspects, which we should learn from a circular economy. So it all goes back, right? It's a more holistic view on nature and society together. I mean, another challenge that we are living and that was constantly in the news pre-COVID, but let's not forget it is still very much there, is refugee camps. I mean, it's a war-torn zones, but also very close to us. I mean, if you think of Calais. and the issues here. And these have some of the characteristics of the informal settlements that you described, right? And refugees, of course, have additional challenges due to displacement, no work, and so forth. And are there lessons we can learn for solutions, also in Europe, where the context is different from a war zone?
There's a lot of fascinating work being done here on, for example, creating shelter and services for refugees that is quick to build, but also does not compromise on human well-being. But as I said, a majority of forced migrants are actually dependent on everyday urban infrastructures, right? And are much more integrated into local urban systems than we think. In the difficult resource allocation that cities have to do, refugees should continue to be viewed as city residents, right? And therefore have a claim to the resources. And equally, the special humanitarian funds that are linked to refugees can be channeled through local municipalities. And I pose an important point here. For example, are we thinking about asylum seekers, about refugees and forced migrants? Are they being considered in COVID-19 vaccination discourse? To be truly safe from the virus, we must achieve full vaccine coverage.
It touches everyone, doesn't it?
And the vaccine infrastructure will likely be location specific and linked with existing health infrastructure. So this is a clear example articulating how and I suppose why cities need to be inclusive in their thinking about addressing challenges thrown up by forced migration pattern.
Thank you very much for this excellent discussion. I very much enjoyed it and your sharing. Thank you for sharing your important work, and at least offer us also a glimpse of hope, showing us the challenges, but by working together, how we can build a more positive future. Thank you, Jaideep.
Thank you, Marc-Olivier.
Thank you very much both for that really interesting discussion. This is just a reminder that this is one of 3 spotlight videos focusing on the individual work of the panelists before they all come together in February in the live panel session on the future of cities, green buildings and sustainable infrastructure. So please do check the AAAS annual meeting website for the panel's date and time. So finally, thanks again very much, Jaideep and Marc-Olivier, for joining, and thank you to you, the audience, for joining too. And we look forward to seeing you live in February.